Hello there, friends. My name is Rachel G&S Middle. Gilbert and Sullivan is my middle name, and my middle name is my last name. And I am here on behalf of Forbear Theatre to explore the magic of the Gilbert and Sullivan operas through very pedantically ranking every element of them. And this week we are going to be discussing the dialogue scenes in The Sorcerer. And making a point about these dialogue scenes videos, and indeed all the videos in this series, although I am using the vehicle of ranking all the elements of these operas, it really is just an excuse to talk about Gilbert and Sullivan. And as you'll have seen from the videos I've posted so far, there are very few elements of them I actively dislike. I think there's only been maybe a couple of songs so far, one of which somebody in the comments actually convinced me, maybe that could be done all right. And I also do think it's worth recognising that Gilbert and Sullivan were not always perfect, particularly Gilbert, as we can see in some of the dialogue scenes. And what I'm trying to do here is kind of get to the heart of what I consider to be most Gilbert and Sullivan-y about Gilbert and Sullivan and figure out why it is that I love them so much. And it's particularly weird to be ranking dialogue scenes. I tend to find that the quality of the dialogue doesn't really vary too much within one opera. It tends to be that the dialogue in one opera seems to be much better than the dialogue in other operas. But this is just a way of talking about the dialogue in one opera, and then eventually we'll be ranking all the dialogue scenes together. Another point to make in my little introduction is that I really hadn't rated The Sorcerer too highly when it came to dialogue in the past. I'd never thought of Sorcerer as being up there when it comes to dialogue, but I think the issue with The Sorcerer is just that there's really not very much dialogue, so I don't think that when you see a production of The Sorcerer, the dialogue leaves a very big impression on you. But in fact, when you just read the dialogue when it's written on the page, it's incredibly sophisticated, and especially Dr. Daly's lines. So I don't know if Gilbert had just really improved in the 4 or 5 years since they did Thespis, or if it was the creation of these specific characters that just helped the language flow out of him. I am using the same parameters that I used in my Thespis video, so if you'd like to know what they are, you can watch the start of that one. Coming in at number 8, we have the Alexis Aline Act II dialogue, which I do personally think should be put after the quintet. A lot of people do that, and that is something that I do as well, because I don't know what Gilbert was really thinking here, but to kind of drop a big emotional bombshell and then to have a comedic scene, I think is odd. Not because it's not okay to mix darkness with comedy, but because it means that you're thinking of this terrible bombshell that Alexis has just dumped on Aline all the way through the comic scene. I think that maybe takes a bit of the comedy out of it, especially since we don't see any evidence of that bombshell in the scene itself. So there's absolutely nothing at all wrong with this scene. I gave it a 26 out of 40. I think it's a perfectly serviceable scene. I'd say off the bat though, I do think it is too short for what it is trying to do. This is a big subversion moment. We are looking at this couple who have been held up as the model of love in this village, and who all the chorus are celebrating getting together. And the fact that we now see that this relationship all along was kind of toxic, we do get scatterings of that in the first act with Aline, you must obey me. You know, that's a bit jarring. But here we see a genuine conflict and Aline's refusal to do what Alexis is telling her. I do think deserves more time than this scene is giving it, so I do think it feels a bit rushed. And for that I only gave it a narrative importance of 7, not because it doesn't progress the narrative, but just because it does so in a way that I think is less than optimal. It's very sudden, like, oh, okay, which maybe that's real life, but I do think when you are giving a bombshell like that, you do have to give the audience a bit of time to absorb it, and I don't think Gilbert recognised how much of a bombshell that was. I gave it a 7 out of 10 for beauty/poetry. I think it is perfectly representative of most of Gilbert's work. I don't think there's anything in it that's truly jaw-dropping, but it is lovely. The miserly wife will check the reckless expenditure of her too frivolous consort. The wealthy husband will shower innumerable bonnets on his penniless bride, and the young and lively spouse will cheer the declining days of her aged partner with comic songs unceasing. What a delightful prospect for him. It is good, it is funny. That, though, I think is really the only joke in the scene, and so for that reason I did give it a 5. I don't think that that joke is particularly funny, but it's fine. It's it's that kind of joke, and there's only one of them. I gave it a 7 out of 10 for character progression. I would have given it higher had the scene just been a bit longer and maybe been given a bit more weight. It happens so suddenly, it happens in about 5 lines. We must drink the philtre ourselves, that I may be assured of your love for ever and ever. Oh, Alexis, do you doubt me? I do appreciate that we get to see a bit more of Aline's character as well. Alexis, it is already far beyond that chance. Have faith in me, for my love can never, never change. And I believe she truly means that. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that Aline doesn't really love Alexis or, you know, is toxically obsessed with him, however you want to put it. And then her response is actually very strong. If you cannot trust me, you have no right to love me, no right to be loved by me. And that is the most powerful she's ever sounded. What I'm trying to say is I do really appreciate this, and I think what is there is really good. It just happens a bit too quickly for us to really absorb the weight of it, and for that it has come last. But I do still think this is a good scene. Number 7 I have given to the Pre-Act II finale scene, where quite a few characters speak. In fact, most of them. Dr. Daly, Alexis, Wells, Aline. In fact, that seems to be it. I'd be very surprised if any of these Pre-Act II finale scenes do particularly well. This one still got a 27 out of 40, which probably makes it one of the better ones. I think the Mikado also has quite a good one, as I alluded to in my base video. And there's certainly some lovely language in here. I gave it the standard mark of 7 out of 10 for just Gilbert being Gilbert and doing a good job. I gave it a 7 out of 10 for narrative importance, not because we don't get to see the story progressing, but because it progresses in a way that is confusing, in a way that maybe isn't consistent with the rest of the opera. We are only just now learning about Aramanes, and I know that there are versions of this opera, and I would very much like to direct it in this way one day, where people have actually put that cut scene with Aramanes back in, and that might make this scene make more sense, but as it is, it's just one of those scenes that is kind of Deus Ex Machina-y, in a sense that Gilbert is just finding a way to end it quickly, without too much consideration for who the characters are and what they've gone through. I did give it 7 out of 10 for comedy, and that is because, yeah, it is witty all the way through, and they also have that very funny joke in the middle of it. Or you or I must yield up his life to Aramanes. I would rather it were you. I should have no hesitation in sacrificing my own life to spare yours, but we take stock next week, and it would not be fair on the co. I think that is so lovely, and it's just such a good example of Gilbert's matter-of-factness and his dryness. And I'll stress again that I don't think there are too many other playwrights that have this kind of tone when they write. Please let me know if there are, because I would like to love them. It annoys me that Aline wants Alexis to survive. That always irritates me. Mr. Wells, if he must die that all be restored to their old loves, what is to become of me? I should be left out in the cold with no love to be restored to. And yeah, I get that she's a bit brainwashed by Alexis, but it still irks me. And I don't think that makes it bad. I just think it's not terribly respectful of what Aline has been through as a character. And for that reason, I am actually a fan of changing the ending of this to save Wells and have Alexis die. I think that is actually the better way of doing this opera, personally. And that, again, that's not because I think Gilbert made a mistake. It's just because perhaps at the time when he was writing, I don't think he quite realised what his writing would sound like to people alive today who really understand abusive relationships and toxic relationships. And to have Alexis and Aline just go back together at the end, you can make a point of that. Like maybe as a director or actors, you want to make a point of, well, that relationship is not really going to be particularly happy after that. Then that's fine, totally, yeah, make that choice. But to just pretend that everything's okay, I don't think works very well in this day and age. Also, another funny narrative thing is when they're talking about people being restored to their old loves. So, okay, let me get this straight, Aline / Alexis, because you're basically a unit. Were you aware that these villagers had old loves? And if so, what on earth were you doing making them fall in love with random people? How dare you? That's terrible. And if this was always going to be a problem, the fact that they've made these people fall in love with other people, why on earth did you do it in the first place? In what universe is this Wells's fault? He was so clear about what he was going to do. He was paid to do a job and he did it. This is entirely Alexis and maybe slightly Aline's fault, this entire situation. And the fact that the chorus are like, yeah, die thou, that's horrible. Poor Wellington Wells. I feel very badly for this character, but I could only give this scene a 7 out of 10, even though a lot of things happen in it narratively, just because the things that do happen don't make a lot of sense and reveal maybe some little plot holes, which, to restate a point that I made when I was talking about Constance, I think, in my soprano characters video, we shouldn't be letting Gilbert get away with these plot holes by saying, oh, it's not meant to make sense, it's topsy-turvy. No, because Gilbert is actually quite consistent in other operas and doesn't tend to make mistakes. So when he does, it is okay to draw attention to them. You know, he's not God. He's just a writer. And I love him more than anybody. And I think it's important when you think about writers you love to discuss why it is you like them and to maybe highlight times when they didn't do so well. And I think this plot of the Sorcerer and just generally this last winding up section is a bit confusing, and I do think it's okay to acknowledge that. Also, Constance doesn't appear, and why not? I gave it a 7 for character progression. I think that when we reach this part of the opera, the characters have already been established, and you don't really tend to see too much of the characters in these final scenes because they're really just trying to give you information. And that is all I have to say about that last scene. Number 6 I have given to the scenes between Constance, Mrs. Partlett and Dr. Daly, which I'm treating as one scene because the first little bit of it is so short it would have just done badly in virtue of how short it was, which I don't think is particularly fair. I do think there are good moments of this scene. I gave a 7 out of 10 for beauty / poetry. Absolutely nothing wrong with the language here. It's lovely language. I just think he's done better elsewhere. I gave it a 7 out of 10 for narrative importance again. On the surface, it seems hugely narratively important. However, as I've alluded to in previous videos, we do not learn anything more about Constance in this opera. Yes, we get to see her falling in love against her will with this old man, but we don't get to hear anything more about her love for Dr. Daly, and that is never resolved. And so for that, I cannot give it higher than a 7. So even though it is story, that story is not wrapped up well. And because I know it isn't, I'm irritated. I actually gave it 7s across the board. I do think it does a good job of telling us who Mrs. Partlett is to a certain extent, and Dr. Daly. That 7 is pretty much purely for Dr. Daly. When I put Constance low down in my soprano characters video, I got a couple of private and public comments saying that Constance is like one of their favourite characters. She's great. And yeah, I like Constance too. I have a lot of fun playing her. But if you actually look at her text, it's really not very inspired. You really have to do stuff as an actor to make that funny, which is fine. But there are other characters in this opera and in other operas who you can just say their lines flat out and they'll get laughs because they're funny. That's not the case with Constance's lines. The only thing you know about Constance is that she loves Dr. Daly, and you don't even know why. But mother dear, he is not yours to give. That is quite a funny line. Oh mother, I cannot speak to him. Oh mother, he does not love me. You know, for the amount that people go on about wanting to play Constance, her material isn't terribly good. It's more just that she is in an amusing situation which talented people can make funny. But the material on its own, it is not strong. It really isn't. But Dr. Daly's material, he's got some great material here. And these lines that he has in this initial scene really do tell us who he is. He has empathy. When Mrs. Partlett says she might lose Constance, Dr. Daly's initial reaction is to think that she's ill. Dear me, you pain me, is she delicate? He's clearly very good at his job. He's a lovely, gentle, kind presence in the village. I think that's such a good starting place to go if you're an actor. You've got a lot of material there to really do a good job. Be still, my fluttering heart. But I have left it too long. I'm an old fogey now, am I not, my dear? A very old fogey indeed. Ha ha! You can definitely see that this was the same writer that wrote Thespis. But it's just so much better. The scenes and the characters and the language is just so much better crafted. But tush, I am puling. Here comes the young Alexis with his proud and happy father. And then, in the midst of his emotion, he's delivering some exposition. He's telling us who these characters are. Dr. Daly is one of these characters who not only is wonderfully emotional, very funny, but is also just excellent at giving exposition as well and helping the story move along. And so I'd say even though this scene got 7s across the board, they're really all because of Dr. Daly. I think if it had just been Constance and Mrs. Partlett, that scene would not have got as high a mark as it did. Number 5, I have given to the teapot scene, which is the scene where Aline is told to fetch the teapot. So this is a scene after Wells's initial patter song. We got a really high mark here for narrative importance. I gave it a 9. I think the way that the character's dialogue progresses the narrative is very skillful here. There's such a good job done of Gilbert attaching emotion to exposition in order to make it go into our heads a little bit better. Sir, we are not in the habit of puffing our goods. Ours is an old established house with a large family connection, and every assurance held at an advertisement is fully realised. So I think having Wells be slightly offended by Alexis actually does help some of the more complicated elements of the story go in, which I appreciate. I would say though that this scene isn't particularly funny compared to some of the other ones. I gave it a 6 out of 10. I don't think it's not funny, it's just because it's just a lot of narrative being given out. And, you know, you do get character progression too, particularly in that section where Alexis tells Aline to get the teapot. Aline, the villagers will assemble to carouse, like that, in a few minutes. Go and fetch the teapot. But Alexis, my dear, you must obey me, if you please. Go and fetch the teapot. And I love that that's just a little hint of what's to come. The fact that he doesn't treat her very well. I think even by Victorian standards, that's not a nice thing for a husband to say to his wife. I actually gave this an 8 for character progression because we do get to learn these little things about Aline and Alexis. Alexis, we get to learn that actually perhaps his relationship with Aline and what he feels for her isn't as wholesome as maybe he'd let on before. And then when Aline responds to this, we get to learn a lot about her as well. Yes, she does obey him, but also she does it in a way where she kind of maintains her dignity. As she walks off, she says, "I'm sure Dr. Daly would disapprove of it." And I think that helps when you're in a toxic relationship like that to want to hold on to some kind of dignity, to some kind of power and control. The fact that she gets together with Dr. Daly in Act 2 as well, albeit very briefly, I do think is very cleverly set up here in a way that I hadn't really realised until I'd read this just now. I mean, I'm not going to give it a 10 just because Wells says, whoever drinks of it loses consciousness for that period and on waking falls in love, as a matter of course, with the very first lady he meets who has also tasted it, and his affection is at once returned. And that's just not how this works. And I know we have talked a lot in the GNS community about the plot holes in The Sorcerer, but just for that reason I cannot give any scene in The Sorcerer a 10 out of 10 for narrative importance / narrative progression, because this is not reflected in the second act when the love potion is actually used. So yeah, I don't think this scene is quite as funny, and I don't think the beauty and the poetry of the language is particularly sophisticated. However, I do think the story is very skillfully progressed, and we do get to learn a bit more about Aline and Alexis, which I appreciate. Number 4, I have given to Aline and Alexis's Act I scene. So this is the scene before Alexis's Act I aria. Now, I gave this an 8 out of 10 for beauty / poetry. I do think the language in this is beautiful and clever and also very funny. So I gave it 8 out of 10 for beauty poetry. I gave it an 8 out of 10 for narrative importance, because we are learning about what Aline and Alexis want and what they're going to do. I gave it a 7 out of 10 for character progression. That's because even though we do get to learn about what Alexis wants, we don't really get to learn too much about who Aline is yet. I also gave it an 8 out of 10 for comedy. And funnily enough, I think the comedy in this scene actually comes from the beauty of the language, because the language is just so ridiculous. At last we are alone. My darling, you are now irrevocably betrothed to me. Are you not very, very happy? That second very, so important. Oh, Alexis, can you doubt it? Do I not love you beyond all on earth? And am I not beloved in return? Is not true love, faithfully given and faithfully returned, the source of every earthly joy? Recognise the glorious principle that in marriage alone is to be found the panacea for every ill. And let's not forget this is satire, so Gilbert is deliberately making a mockery of this statement, because he knows that's not true. We all know that's not true. And what's so good is that I do think that we appreciate the humour of this more today than back then, because even today, people just automatically get married. Like, getting married is a thing that is more commonly done, and most young people, I'd say, even still now, just assume they're going to get married. Maybe that's not quite so true with young 20-somethings today. If you're very young, tell me that's not true. But certainly, as a 36-year-old, when I was in my late teens, early 20s, we all just assumed we'd get married. And it's only really in recent years that I've realised how arbitrary that is, and the idea of just getting married as a matter of course, just completely joining your life with somebody. That's a big decision to make. You need to be very sure what you're doing is the right thing. So if you've not found the right person, I think getting married is very silly. And so I'd like to think that Gilbert, maybe, even if he didn't agree with me, because of course he wouldn't have done, he lived in a very different time, but I do think he was recognising that society places this huge amount of importance on marriage, and that'll just solve all of your problems, which he knew was not the case. The whole joke about the uneducated classes and not a navvy descended. I think sometimes Gilbert and Sullivan can be seen on the surface as being something liked by upper class people, by rich people, by older people. But then a lot of the times the social commentary just completely matches what I believe is a very left-wing person. And even sometimes when they have these comments like, he is a noble creature, when he is quite sober, to me, that is more disparaging of the person talking than it is on the people he's talking about. It's funny how Gilbert is highlighting here how patronising upper class people can be, even when they are trying to be sympathetic, but they're just kind of failing, really. I love this scene. It's got several laugh out loud bits in it. If we were told maybe a bit more about who Aline is, I think I would have liked the scene a bit better. But as it is, I do think it's lovely. Number 3, I have given to the scene between the two scenes I have just talked about, which is the scene where it starts off with Aline and Alexis talking and then Wells is introduced. I think this is an absolutely fabulous scene. When I auditioned for the Savoy-Net Sorcerer 11 years ago now, I remember filming this scene in a park and I just thought it was the funniest scene ever. Because it delivers exposition in a way that is skillful, because it's got emotion attached to it, it's delivered very clearly, but it's also done in this really funny kind of tongue-in-cheek way, as if this just isn't the way that people speak. But in the way it's delivered here, you actually really believe it because these characters have been set up so well in a previous scene. So we learn in a previous scene, this is the way these characters are speaking. And then we get to see them delivering proper narrative. Yes, Aline, and I'm going to take a desperate step in support of them. Have you ever heard of the firm J.W. Wells & Co., the old established family sorcerers in St. Mariacs? I have seen their advertisement. It's just so matter of fact, but I think that was entirely intentional. I think the clunkiness of this exposition was completely deliberate on Gilbert's part, and I am here for it. The confusion over the word filter, perfect. I gave this an 8 out of 10 for beauty/poetry. I think some of the language is lovely, especially when Wells comes in and delivers that little monologue. But also there is some lines earlier on in it which I just think are beautiful. Aline, is it or is it not a laudable object to steep the whole village up to its lips in love, and to couple them in matrimony without distinction of age, rank or fortune? I think these lines are so well crafted. They're beautiful, they really are. Oh, Alexis, I don't think it would be right. I don't indeed. And then, a real magician. Oh, it would be downright wicked. I love Aline in this scene. She seems like she's constantly trying to fight against Alexis, but he's just dismissing her. But she keeps trying. I think that shows that there is some fight left in her. There is some spark inside her, which is really nice. I gave it a 7 for character progression. I think the reason it didn't get higher is because it is mostly exposition. It's mostly narrative. And I gave it a 9 for that. I also gave it a 9 for comedy, for everything I've said. I think it is just one of these truly lovely, perfect scenes. It's just got so many sweet little comedic moments in it. Hercules? Yes, sir. Is Mr. Wells there? He's in the tent, sir. Refreshing. It's just, what does that mean? It's such a silly little thing. This did not need to happen. They could have just gone, hello, anyone in there? Mr. Wells could have come out. But I just like it. It's just this extra layer of ridiculousness. And also, as I've alluded to in my soprano characters videos, one of my favourite lines in the entire canon, it's nonsense, dear, to talk of your protecting me with your strong right arm in face of the fact that this family sorcerer could change me into a guinea pig before you could turn round. I absolutely love that line, and the line that follows it. He could change you into a guinea pig, no doubt, but it is most unlikely that he would take such a liberty. It's the most respectable firm, and I'm sure he would never be guilty of so untradesmanlike an act. What I love about GNS, and I'm going to keep saying this, is the fact that we are in these universes where magic is real, yet they are speaking very normally, as if this is just par for the course for them. They are about to visit a magician, and Aline is quite rightfully perturbed about it. But Alexis is treating this as if just an entirely normal business engagement, which maybe in their world it is. Good day. I believe you are a sorcerer. Again, just matter of fact. Really, really great scene. This one got a 33 out of 40. And off the top of my head, I don't think anything in Thespis got that high. Number 2, I have given to the scene between Alexis and Sir Marmaduke in the first act. And this really surprised me, because I didn't realise how funny Marmaduke was until I'd made that bass video. Madam, I trust you are in the enjoyment of good health. Sir, you are vastly polite. I've already talked about that. That is very funny, but that's not the only thing in this scene. It's very cleverly crafted, and every single line in it is reflective of the character talking. You get the combination of this person who is not at all scared to express himself and this person who is very repressed. And when those two people clash, it is very funny. Oh, rapture! A joke about Helen of Troy. So I gave this one an 8 out of 10 for comedy. I don't think it's maybe quite as funny as the one before it or the one above it. I gave it a 9 out of 10 for character progression because of what I've just said. You really get to learn so much about these characters in every line. Father, I am welling over with limpid joy. No sickling taint of sorrow overlies the lucid lake of liquid love, upon which, hand in hand, Aline and I are to float into eternity. Yes, aside from the fact that it's not real, like nobody would ever speak like this, it is beautiful, and because it's so beautiful, that makes it funny. 9 out of 10 for beauty/poetry. 8 out of 10 for narrative importance. I think in this instance, the narrative importance and character progression go hand in hand. Sometimes because you are learning a lot of stuff about the narrative, it actually stops characters from being able to be their characters and show the audience who they are. But in this instance, the narrative is who the characters are. And so that's why I love this scene so much. Even though this is actually technically part of the recit, Dr. Daly also begins this scene in a tremendously hilarious way. So I'm not including that little bit in the points here. I think it would have done even better had I really included that bit, but just giving you the context of having had Dr. Daly talking about the joyous foreground, etc. And that leads you straight into the scene, which I think is just glorious. It is just the perfect start to these ridiculous upper class people having this really fake conversation. I love the pre-song line here. Aline approaches, let us retire, that she may compose herself for the interesting ceremony in which she is to play so important a part. It's just the choice of words there is so ridiculous. Who on earth would describe anything to do with an engagement or a wedding as an interesting ceremony? Like, romantic, beautiful, interesting. Can you imagine going to a wedding? It was a really interesting wedding. Even though this scene is relatively short, every single line in it I think is so funny. And especially when it's done very well with good actors as well. Mwah! Perfect. Number 1 of the dialogue scenes in The Sorcerer I have given to the scene that immediately precedes the quintet, and I am loosely thinking in the back of my mind that the scene between Aline and Alexis has not happened yet, because there's no evidence of it in this scene, and I prefer it that way. But regardless, it's gonna come top either way, because it is one of the best scenes, I think, in the canon, and we'll soon realise if that is true. I gave it a 36 out of 40. So I gave it a 9 out of 10 for beauty and poetry. I gave it an 8 out of 10 for narrative importance. I don't think that this relationship between Marmaduke and Mrs. Partlett is particularly important story-wise, apart from what it shows Aline and Alexis about what they've done. So I think it makes Alexis realise that maybe this wasn't such a good idea, but he's also stupid for that being the only thing that made him realise that, because of course that was going to happen. Alexis! Ugh. I gave it a 9 out of 10 for comedy/wit, and I gave it a 10 out of 10 for character progression. Every single character in this scene is important to what is happening in the scene. They learn something about the others and about themselves. They are perfectly representing who their characters have been set up to be previously. I just think this is a very skillful job done, especially character-wise, but really across the board. Let me talk about it in a little bit more detail. First of all, Dr. Daly, I mean, his dialogue must be one of the best dialogue that any character has. It is singular. It is very singular. You're a star. Have you ever heard anyone in your life describe something as singular? I absolutely love the fact that he just says something very simple in a needlessly complicated way. Dear Dr. Daly, what has puzzled you? Even just the fact he says, your excellent father. What a funny way to describe a person. The fact that The Sorcerer is about upper class people, I think makes it so funny, because we get to see how stupid it is the way these characters talk to each other. And the fact that Alexis just assumes that it's his father and Aline's mother. He's such an idiot, this character. But the young maidens of this village are very comely. So likewise are the middle-aged. Also the elderly. And then, realising that Marmaduke is not with Lady St. he's actually with Mrs. Partlett. That must have been very funny at the time. Mrs. Partlett! And then, yeah, this section following, when Mrs. Partlett is introduced, you really get to find out who Alexis is a bit more, where he's very polite to his father about it, but then it is not quite what I could have wished, he says aside to Aline. And this is why I don't like his aria to Aline just having occurred before, because he's then subtly conspiratorial with Aline in a way that I don't know if he would be. Yet then again, toxic people in relationships maybe wouldn't place so much weight on their toxic behaviour and would just assume, okay, well that's over now. Now I can just talk to Aline like everything's normal. So you never know. Dr. Daly's line here, again, one of the funniest lines in Gilbert and Sullivan. Yes, beauty will fade and perish, but personal cleanliness is practically undying, for it can be renewed whenever it discovers symptoms of decay. It's just so matter of fact. And yes, of course, it's true, but it's just the kind of thing that nobody would ever say. And for that, I love it. So, all in all, I just absolutely love this scene. It is certainly my favourite scene that I've discussed so far. The picnic scene in Thespis, I did think was a bit more wacky and off the wall, but I just want to recognise how wonderfully crafted all these scenes are in The Sorcerer. And I really hadn't realised myself just how good the dialogue in The Sorcerer is. But it does require work, I think, to deliver these lines in such a way that it seems like you're talking normally. And I think that can be a lot of work for actors. If you're doing a production of The Sorcerer in the future, really take the time to appreciate how funny this dialogue is. It is so good. So, in conclusion, I am no longer going to forget about The Sorcerer when I'm making my list of Gilbert and Sullivan operas. I think The Sorcerer, certainly dialogue-wise, is one that I hadn't rated highly, but my mind really has been changed, and you can see just how much Gilbert had improved from Thespis. And it really is remarkable, the difference. It's night and day, I think, between the two of them. And it's been a joy to discover that today. Thank you so much for watching. As ever, please do hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and do engage in the comments section as well. I know I have put these videos out on Facebook, but it would be great if you could actually engage in the video itself. I would really appreciate that. Next time, we're going to be looking at the baritone arias, and there are rather a lot of baritone arias, so that may be a rather long video to make up for this slightly shorter one. Until then, have a lovely week, and I will see you soon.
Hercules? Yes, sir. Is Mr. Wells there? He's in his tent, sir. Refreshing. Ask him to be so good as to step this way. Yes, sir.
But oh, Alexis, a real sorcerer! I shall be frightened to death.
I trust my Aline will not yield to fear, while the strong right arm of her Alexis is there to protect her.
It's nonsense, dear, to talk of you protecting me with your strong right arm, in face of the fact that this family sorcerer could turn me into a guinea pig before you could turn round.